Good day and welcome to St. Lucia, the Caribbean and the world, especially to viewers at home and abroad, as well as to St. Lucia's Minister for Creative Industries, Dr. Ernest Hilaire, and other members of the Cabinet and of the Parliament of St. Lucia listening and viewing at this point in time. Welcome to this special NTN presentation in honor of the International Day for Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, observed yesterday, the 24th day of August, or should I say yesterday on the 23rd, and we are presenting on it today, August the 24th. Today we'll take you on a journey into the unknown with our presenter and our NTN technical team in what we hope will be another memorable event on the National Emancipation Month 2022 calendar. Our main presenter today is Dr. Morgan Dalfini, a St. Lucian and Caribbean man and a historian, poet, researcher, and author on St. Lucian history and Caribbean and African languages. Born in St. Lucia and based in London, Dr. Dalfini has also written much on St. Lucian Creole and its link to African and Caribbean languages, the links between the Caribbean and African culture as well. He's very active in promoting taking Creole to St. Lucia's schools and giving the nation's first language its rightful place. His poetry explores St. Lucia in both its languages and all its cultural expressions, and his books range over generations and years, the one I most remember being For Those Who Will Come After, written in the 70s, and which I must confess was one of my own early influences in the process of discovery of my St. Lucian self. That bit of late in life confession over back to Dr. Dalfini, who still is building a lasting legacy in the United Kingdom as an embodiment of all that I have just said. Dr. Dalfini is a committed lifetime contributor to the continuing documentation of St. Lucia's history, and while having written much about the island's history, his latest book, which we will learn about here today, is the longest documented account of the longest period of St. Lucia's history, and we have a copy of the book which we will offer to show you, and it's entitled History and Language in St. Lucia for the period 1654 to 1915. I repeat, from 1654 to 1915, all of 261 years of St. Lucia's history that every researcher or person interested in St. Lucia's history should do everything to access. Today, Dr. Dalfini will share with us his thoughts on a wide range of issues relating to the connection between the transatlantic slave trade and the call by CARICOM governments for reparations for slavery and native genocide from Europe, the significance of August 23rd, yesterday, and why he wrote St. Lucia's latest history book, and of course how we can get it. More on Dr. Dalfini. His research takes him between the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa, with visits to St. Lucia in between, and today he'll talk to us from St. Kitts and Nevis. So, why are we here today, and why is the United Nations calling on Caribbean and African governments, first of all, to observe August 23rd? Well, here's a little bit of background. You see, according to UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education, Social, Cultural Organization, on the night of the 22nd and 23rd August in 1791, in Saint-Domingue, the place that today is the Republic of Haiti, half of the island of Hispaniola, saw the beginning of the uprising that would play a crucial role in the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. It is against this background that the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition is commemorated on 23rd of August each year. And of course, it was first celebrated, in case you didn't know, in a number of countries, in particular in Haiti, on the 23rd of August 1998, and on Gorée Island in Senegal, which we will learn a bit more about as well, on the 23rd of August 1999. All of that was 24 and 25 years ago. This International Day 2022 is intended to inscribe the tragedy of the slave trade in the memory of all peoples around the world. And in accordance with the goals of the intercultural project called The Roots of Enslaved Peoples, it should offer an opportunity, that is the observance of August 23rd every year, should offer an opportunity for collective consideration of the historic causes, the methods, and the consequences of this tragedy, and for an analysis of the interactions to which it has given rise between Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Audrey Azoulay, the Director General of UNESCO, says today, and I quote her, "It is time to abolish human exploitation once and for all, and to recognize the equal and unconditional dignity of each and every individual. Today, let us remember the victims and freedom fighters of the past, so they may inspire future generations to build just societies." Now, folks, the Director General of UNESCO also invited ministers of culture of all member states, including the Caribbean and the Americas, Africa and Europe, all countries touched by the transatlantic slave trade, meaning the entire world, to organize events every year on August 23rd, involving the entire population of each country, and in particular young people, educators, artists, and intellectuals. And we are very pleased to be joined by the Minister of Creative Industries of St. Lucia, Dr. Hilaire, who we will hope to hear from before the end of this program. And obviously, CARICOM community governments are still considering the call by UNESCO to put August 23rd on the calendar. So it is hoped that today's presentation by Dr. Dalfini and the discussion that it will generate will help make the case for continuing inclusion of this important date on the National Emancipation Month calendar, not only for 2022, but also for 2023 and 2024 and beyond. Why? To inscribe in our psyche, as part of the continuing process of emancipating and freeing ourselves from mental slavery, which, as Bob Marley reminds us, forever, none but ourselves can free our minds. It is against this background, like I said, that the National Reparations Committee and the Cultural Development Foundation organized today's presentation by Dr. Dalfini. But before we introduce our esteemed presenter, we'll share with you two related short videos from UNESCO, especially for today. The first is about the human tragedy of unknown history that the transatlantic slave trade was, leaving with us a shared heritage from the roots of the slave trade, especially in this case along the so-called Great Triangle that we learned about at school that started with ships leaving Europe with royal assent to go to Africa, to kidnap and chain and claim, insure and ship captured Africans to the Caribbean and the Americas like property, sold them into slavery and condemned them to lives of misery and exploitation that prevented most from living past 30 years old. And the last point about Europe's Great Triangle was the shipping of the profits from this region to Europe to continue the slavery cycle for another 400 years. But the worst was that called the Middle Passage, the direct route from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas, with a route that depopulated Africa by millions and created the new world of people of African descent that we celebrate later this month on August 31st. This following video is about UNESCO's Slave Routes project between 1994 and 2014, a 25-year project that went everywhere that slavery went and the long road traveled. Let's follow UNESCO's route to slavery. For the purposes of today, we've listed 10 issues largely on people's minds that we hope you'll better understand some of, if not all, after we hear from our esteemed presenter and historian, Dr. Dalfini. And among those issues are: 1. Why was transatlantic slavery, or what was transatlantic slavery, and why was it different? Why is August 23rd an important date in the Caribbean's anti-slavery history? What's the difference between August 1st and August 23rd, Emancipation Day, and August 23rd? Why the CARICOM community is calling for reparations from the United Kingdom and Europe? Africa, we look at Africa and the call for global reparations. Where does Africa stand in that? The Caribbean and the decade for people of African descent, which we will observe in a week from today on the 31st of August. How France's reparation demand doomed Haiti. Why St. Lucians must learn. And of course, other Caribbean people, St. Lucians at home and abroad in particular, about the 1795 battle at Rabot in Soufrière. Why history and Creole must go back to school in St. Lucia, and ultimately what Dr. Dalfini's latest book is about, and of course where we can get it. So we want to welcome Dr. Dalfini and the floor, or rather the global platform from right here at the NTN studio at Touganier in Castries, St. Lucia, is yours, Dr. Dalfini, to tell us why it's important for St. Lucians and Caribbean citizens and people of African descent the world over should still care today, in 2022, 188 years after slavery was officially abolished, about remembering the transatlantic slave trade. Over to you, Dr. Dalfini.
Oh, merci bien, Earl. Jodi jou, che mwen ouve gwan, kon banan kon gwan bois. Today I am very happy to join you, almost like a flower of banana leaves in the high woods. What I will do is talk generally about some of the reparation issues raised, talk about my book, and end up making some recommendations. The first thing is that most societies historically had some form of slavery, particularly domestic slavery. Indeed, in Africa, there were many instances of domestic slavery. The problem, however, is that that type of slavery did not stop people getting on within the society. For instance, Bayajida, the founder of the Hausa kingdom, was a slave. And many other instances like that leave you with the idea that one slavery, domestic slavery, was there, but it was not like the Atlantic slave trade. In Kanuri society, you could have many types of slave. There was the slave of the money, the slave of the horse, the slave of the houses, and many others. And in such a society, I would love to have been the slave of the money, because I would control all of the money. So although the people were entitled slave, their focus and their scope in terms of controlling their own society, very different from the Atlantic slave trade. Arab slavery, even with its similarities to the Atlantic slave trade, did not stop you as a descendant of the master and the slave becoming somebody who ruled the society. In many cases, when you see some of the rulers in the Middle East, you're surprised when they take off their turban that they've got African features, curly hair, just like you and me, because that type of slavery did not abolish their human rights. The closest phrase I could give you about the whole thing is when I first started studying about languages and Africa and slavery. A friend of mine in Nigeria said to me, "Well, Morgan, we always had slavery. The white people showed us how to perfect it." By that, he meant, perhaps cynically, that never in human history was slavery as industrialized and as perfidious, with that amount of human loss of life and with that degree of apartheid, as when the Atlantic slave trade was put in place. And indeed, as Walter Rodney, the late Walter Rodney, points out, it totally decimated African development and totally decimated the populations. As far as the issue of August 23rd, I think Earl has said most of what there is to say about that. That August the 23rd marks the Haitian Revolution in 1791, and that UNESCO has moved that we use that date rather than the 1st of August to commemorate the end of slavery. Because in a sense, that date makes us active in the abolishment of slavery. Slavery was not abolished because people suddenly liked us. It was abolished, partly at least, because we fought. Because of our fighting, the slave trade became uneconomic. And as a consequence of that, the Haitian fight for freedom is one which makes us actors in our own freedom, rather than a view that freedom was given to us. On the reparations issues, many groups, including the Jews, have been given reparations for crimes committed against them. The extreme crimes committed against Africans and indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and in Africa are in need of reparations purely from the point of view of human justice. African countries should also be involved in the bid for reparations, because although one could argue there was some participation by Africans within the Atlantic slave trade, it was a participation often forced upon them. The classic example is the Kingdom of Dahomey, where the Portuguese asked whether they could get slaves from Dahomey. The King of Dahomey refused. He thought it was inhuman. The Portuguese suddenly then went to sell guns to all of the neighbors of Dahomey so that they could attack Dahomey. The only way to get the guns was by forced participation in the slave trade. So the King of Dahomey then created the post of the Yévégon, who coordinated slavery in Dahomey, not because they wanted it, but it was forced upon them. As this is the decade of people of African descent, we must jointly join with African countries in that bid for reparations. If we can look at reparations in a kind of different type of way, Haiti was forced to pay reparations to the French because they ended the slave trade in Haiti. The French wanted payment by the Haitians in order that they were recompensed for their losses in the end of slavery in Haiti. This legacy devastated the Haitian economy. And up to now, you could argue that becoming a failed state was inevitable if somebody is asking you payment after they have oppressed you. Now, given that kind of situation, it would be purely part of human justice if all of us, indigenous people and Africans in the Caribbean and Africa, received payment for all of the free labor that was enjoyed on our backs during the slave trade. My book is really a guide to St. Lucian history and language, and partly the justice of demanding reparations. The book itself takes on the St. Lucian struggle and the St. Lucian fight for freedom, which gave us a few years of freedom from slavery. An important part of it is the Battle of Rabot in 1795, where St. Lucians defeated the British purely on their own terms, i.e., in that battle, we won it not because of French support, but purely by ourselves. And this kind of theme of, in a sense, searching our own redemption is something that comes quite clearly in the analysis of St. Lucian history. I'll now turn to say a few words about the book, History and Language in St. Lucia, 1654 to 1915. It, in a sense, starts off talking about motivation to write the book, dedication and acknowledgements, like most books. It looks at the African context, the local context of Arawaks, Carib, and Black Caribs, Africans from the point of view of resistance, revolt, and revolution in St. Lucia, the role of free coloreds, Barbadians, and then looks at the future for St. Lucia by looking at the future in the past and present, as well as articulating some of my hopes for the future. If I move to the beginning, motivation and context, the quotation, dedication, and acknowledgement. I start with a quote that I got from a St. Lucian, which I felt summarized in perhaps a sarcastic way part of our reality. To every problem, there is a St. Lucian. We must find and create more St. Lucians. So, on the one hand, we have created problem solvers like Arthur Lewis, Sir Dwight Verner, and many others. On the other hand, some of us create many problems for ourselves, and that is our duality. In terms of dedication, it's dedicated to the St. Lucian people and says that our lives have been affected by a history of slavery, colonization, betrayals by some of our leaders, as well as a culture of dissonance and dislocation amongst ourselves. However, within all this, we have snatched moments of creativity, identity, freedom, unity, scholarship, resourcefulness, and hope. And so within our dualities, it is on the last positive ones that the next generation may build. In terms of my acknowledgements, I acknowledge the work of other St. Lucians, Bruce Gill from Castries, Hospital Road, in fact, for his editorial comments, Dr. Adrian Antoine from Choiseul for his preface, and Henri Smith from Marisul for his excellent artwork, I think, at any rate, for the book cover. as far as acknowledgements are concerned, about 38 years ago, moi j'étais toujours un petit garçon, in a way. I was still a little boy. I was at the Goree slave fort mentioned by Earl, in the room and facing the slit in the wall where captives would go through to the smaller boats, leading to the larger boats and the last memory of home. I felt a sudden electric current between myself and the soil. I pray that I have used this electric current through the ancestors to cleanse the damp, to enlighten within the darkness, to pass on in my own small way the lightning of freedom, éclairs liberté. As far as the African element in our history, most of our histories begin purely straight in the Caribbean. I think we need to look at ancient African history first before we come to the Caribbean. In the past, in 3.3 million years ago, Africans created language, the idea of family, and more than that, the capacity to think. All of those were created by Africans for the rest of humanity. Our West African empires and civilizations in 750, 1214, right onwards to 1591, created memorable civilizations in terms of which people thrived and tried to sort out the problems of humanity. A major activity for them was trade in gold and other issues, and another issue for them also was learning, thinking of the University of Timbuktu. We were on our own road, on our own paths for a long, long time, even leaving Egypt aside, before we encountered enslavement. Enslavement came with the Arabs, and they brought us across the desert to India, China, and other places. And if you want more information on that, you could look at Islam's Black Slaves by an author called Siegel, and the book was written in 2002. In terms of the African and European context in St. Lucia, the push factors, i.e. the things that pushed us into St. Lucia, were various bits of expansion, partly promoted by Europeans and partly promoted by ourselves. So in 1600, the Mandinka Empire was expanding. It expanded not only from its own local area in areas such as the north of Senegal and Mali, but they went into other territories into the south where you find people like the Jola. And as a consequence of that expansion, people from the areas of the conquered, the victims within Africa, would have ended up in St. Lucia. In the case of the Jola, when you think of when we say ting ting, washes, tout ça bon Dieu mette à sous la terre, you don't think that it's a Jola saying to you, taling, taling. It is as simple as that. That person was in the way of Mandinka expansion and they got exported. In the Wolof area, the Wolof caste system had in it various layers of people, royalty, bodyguard caste, and others. The bodyguard caste are important because they're called the Tonjon, and what they did was they overthrew the Wolof royalty, and again, it would have been Wolof royalty sent over to St. Lucia. They were in the way of that particular expansion. One of the widest forms of expansion were Fulani jihadists. They were spreading Islam in what they called the Bilad Sudan, the land of the blacks, and people from many parts of the Caribbean all know one bit of their legacy, i.e. juk. Im juk me, I juke moi garçon. They poked or stabbed me. It is a Fulani word. And the reason that it is so widespread is that the Fulani covered an area from Sudan all the way towards Wolof areas and others in West Africa. Added to that, there was Ashanti conflict and expansion. The Ashantis in the hinterland had conflict with the coastal peoples, the Fanti. And the Ashanti often won. However, in one case, the Chromanti group of the Fanti defeated the Ashanti. And as a consequence of that, the Ashanti swore blood oaths that they would get their revenge. And when they did get their revenge, lots of victims who had been beaten were sent over to places like St. Lucia and other parts of the Caribbean. So they featured so well amongst the people in the Caribbean that in Jamaica they set up maroon societies so that in looking at their capacity for military, the British then decided they were going to stop importing Chromantis into Jamaica. You also had many of them featuring in Barbados, in the early part of Barbados, 1600, where again they were forming many revolts. In St. Lucia, we have bits of their legacy. When we talk about Cancan, we're using a Ghanaian word. When we say Misiemweni win, you're just using a Ghanaian word. When you say Sasa ye, the ye is definitely from that source. That kind of expansion also happened in Dahomey, amongst the Ewe-Fon, and among the Igbo in Nigeria and the Kingdom of the Congo. However, in the St. Lucian case, the push factors affecting us were two. One, those which were influenced by the French, i.e. Wolof and Mandinka, Dahomians, and Congolese. And secondly, those impacted on by the British, namely from Ghana and Nigeria. Before we get to Africans in St. Lucia, we have to talk also about the indigenous people. They didn't just sit there and say, Massa, come, vini, vini, garçon, point mayok mwen, ouè, mwen kontan ou vini pou kwaze la vi mwen. They did not purely say, come and defeat me. They fought. And as you know, in areas of St. Lucia, some of which we call Masque, but it's really massacre, where the Caribs fought back against the invaders. Their story is coming from South America and coming into the islands where they met the Arawak. They killed off the Arawak men and took over the women. They brought up the children as Carib, and those children were known as island Carib. However, as things go on, they meet with the Europeans and conflict resolves. And in that conflict, particularly in St. Vincent, they also mix with Africans and become Black Caribs. As a consequence of that, many thanks for the slide there, in 1655, the French-Carib Wars in Martinique happened. And you have lots of Carib descriptions of the French cannon as mabouya coming out of the mouth of the cannons, lizards coming out of the mouth of the French cannons. You had two French governors in St. Lucia who were killed by the island Carib in 1654 and 1656. In fact, one of those governors, perhaps perhaps he thought he had a little protection. He married a Carib woman, but the Caribs still carried out their famous method: through the window, cutlass, chop their neck. So those were their resistances in the face of invasion. The Black Caribs in 1700, the St. Vincent Black Carib, acting as one people with Black people as Maroons, were so successful that when the British finally conquered them in 1794, they exported them to then British Honduras, currently known as Belize. In the African case, as I said, the first three groups, Senegambian, Angolan, and Dahomians, were people brought in by the French in 1698. However, very soon after that, many of them ran into the St. Lucian bush, into the highlands, and became Maroons. Indeed, St. Lucia became so famous as a place for Maroons that people as far as Trinidad, people from Barbados and St. Vincent, all ran to St. Lucia in order to get away from slavery. In 1791, with the French Revolution being announced, St. Lucians embraced that cause. They thought it was a good idea and decided to join the French Revolution. However, British conquest in 1796 brought British rule. And in that, Africans from Ghana and Eastern Nigeria, mainly Igbos, were then brought in, as well as others from various other places in 1815. In 1824, this was followed by a second wave of Maroons, i.e., we had succeeded as a people to pass on ideas that had worked for us as conquered people under slavery to the newcomers into St. Lucia. With the end of slavery in St. Lucia in 1840, East Indians were brought in as indentured labor and liberated Africans in 1850. Those liberated Africans were dominantly from Sierra Leone. And ironically, when I checked the death rate was similar to slavery, although slavery had been abolished. In terms of the resistance of St. Lucians, the fact that St. Lucian was owned by the Compagnie des Îles d'Amérique, which had transformed its Senegambian assets into La Compagnie du Sénégal, had left the issue that this company had always named the governors of St. Lucia right up to 1674. So that the initial link with Gorée, with Senegal for St. Lucia is a key issue. Indeed, one of the things I found strange was, not strange, but ironic, I found somebody getting a passport from Senegal to St. Lucia in that period. As far as our resistance is concerned, you can see Senegal and Gambia, Angola and Dahomey being the areas, and that the main groups, Wolof and Mandinka, Congo and Umbundu, and the Beni and Evi Fon. I mean, indeed, one song that I remember from the oral literature literally names the Congo. It says, Dendeloti Congo asulame mama. Dendeloti Congo asulame papa. Dendeloti Congo kanaviji mama. The little Congo is on the waves. The little Congo is navigating, mother. In terms of the period of revolt and revolution, St. Lucians run away from their plantations, but this was also supplemented by runaways from plantations in Martinique between 1698 and 1790. As far as the Maroons from Martinique were concerned, the enforcement of Napoleon's Code Noir meant that mulattoes who had been previously automatically free in Martinique were now slaves. So they got the one-drop rule in reverse. So instead of, so many drops of white will bring you up in the world, one drop of black will bring you down. So as a consequence of that, many of them ran off to St. Lucia and often became Maroons. And with that, we have the phrase from St. Lucia about Martinicans saying, Monsieur, vous êtes un sacré passe-pater. Mister, you didn't come by water, you came by land. An ironic comment. One of the things that also favored revolution in St. Lucia is that it was the petits blancs who came to St. Lucia, the small whites. The grands blancs, the big whites, remained in Martinique. They stayed there, and the petits blancs had seen St. Lucia as a means of getting some kind of land, which the Grands Blancs, the big whites, had taken in Martinique. As a consequence of that, their kind of thinking would have been more pro-revolutionary. They could see something in it for them in terms of killing off their own white masters. And within this revolution, St. Lucians were enthusiastic.
Dr. Dalfini?
Yes?
Dr. Dalfini, we would like to take a short break here.
Okay,
if you
no
could
problem.
hear me.
Oui, Mokatanu. Can you hear me?
Hey, what's happening? This is Marcus Miller. Greetings from Marseille. I just want to acknowledge the 25th anniversary of the Slave Route Project, which is a UNESCO project aimed at raising awareness of slavery around the world. And I think this project is really important. It's done a lot of good work. It's gotten people, it's gotten countries to acknowledge slavery, to acknowledge the history of slavery, particularly the transatlantic slave trade. I wrote a song called Gore a few years ago after I visited Senegal and visited the island of Gore. And I tried to make sure that that song had the feeling, okay, had the emotion that I was feeling when I had someone describe to me what it was like for the captives, the African captives who were held in this place before they were sent off on a ship into slavery. It's a really deep feeling. You hear about it, and yes, you react to it emotionally, but when you're there, it's a whole nother thing. I've been playing it all around the world. I played it steadily for like 5 years. It became a song that everyone was expecting me to play because it resonated for so many people. People who have no connection to slavery, whose ancestors maybe weren't slaves, but everybody relates to it. And I think that's what slavery means to me. That's what it does to me. That's why I'm the spokesperson for UNESCO, because that slave experience really informs my music. One of the things about slavery is that it brought out a quality in people that maybe they didn't even know they had. I mean, the resilience, the ability to overcome 400 years of that situation where they weren't in control of their own destiny, and they were separated from their culture, from their family, from their heritage, okay? And to still find a way to find something to live for and to create the beauty that these slaves and these former slaves have created. And I'm talking specifically about music.
But with this song, I decided I didn't want to just make it about anger and pain and resentment. I decided also I wanted to make this song a celebration, y'all, of the ability of human beings to overcome horrible periods of history. I don't know how they did it. These were my ancestors. I have no idea how they found the strength. But what I think is that music played a very important part. These captive Africans, they couldn't read, they couldn't write, but they told their story through music, through the rhythms. And if you listen to all the different styles of music that made their way from the slave experience, you can hear the story. Talking spirituals, field songs, gospel, New Orleans jazz, rock and roll, soul music, funk music, hip hop. It's all a result of this slave experience.
It's really important that people know the history of slavery, especially young people. It really helps people to be empathetic, okay, about the plight, about the feelings, about how descendants of slaves feel about situations, okay? I know in my music, okay, the history of my people really informs my music. It gives it depth, it gives it meaning, okay? And there's a lot of musicians who are descendants of slaves who feel the same way. It's really important that we transmit that message to people and we transmit the information. By the way, it's 400 years since the first slaves landed in Jamestown, in Virginia. 400 years, so we have to acknowledge that anniversary as well. But it's the 25th anniversary of UNESCO's Slave Root Project, and that's a really positive thing. We have to keep going. I'm really happy that they asked me to be the spokesperson because it's something that I really feel is important, and I have no problem going around the world and trying to deliver that message. Happy 25th anniversary to UNESCO's Slave Root Project. Marcus Miller, out.
Back to our presentation today. That was Marcus Miller with his musical journey from Goree, and as you heard from him, the connection between slavery and all the various forms and genres of black music worldwide today. And we return to our interesting presentation from Dr. Dalfini in St. Kitts. So back to you, Dr. Morgan Dalfini.
Many thanks for that, Il. But just talking a little about Goree. When I was there, I definitely had those feelings that he talked about. That feeling as if the dead were with you. And that feeling that the dead managed above everything, despite everything, malgré tout, to survive, was also there. Indeed, I was so moved that I sent my Wolof guide at the time to get a bottle of strong drink and pour it in the soil and to do a libation in Wolof that never in history will we do something as stupid as this again. On the other hand, when the artist there spoke about musicians, etc., what we have to remember is we were musicians before the slave trade, that all of these oral traditions and music were with us before we went through slavery and went into the Americas. So that when people start singing in jazz, the jelly, that is a word in Mandinka to talk about the singer. And we have loads of oral tradition in terms of music and song. Indeed, the Mandinka Empire was, if you like, supported by the musicians under Sunjata. But I'll go back to St. Lucia and the period of revolution. The choice made by French soldiers and citizens of St. Lucia to favor the rights of man, La Déclaration des droits de l'homme. They also sent a representative from St. Lucia to Martinique, where our representative said, nous bénissons la révolution, nous la pensons comme la plus belle ouvre jamais de sortie de la main des hommes. We bless the revolution. We think it is the greatest thing that has ever come from the hands of man. However, in terms of Newton's law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The empires, both English and French, struck back. 17,000 British troops invade St. Lucia in 1796. St. Lucians go for a guerrilla movement in the St. Lucian woods and continue fighting till 1797. However, after capture, some of us were deported to England on a boat called the London. When the boat got off the coast of Devon, it perished within a storm. In terms of Martinique, in 1824, many of the people were deported to Gorée in Senegal after interrogation in France. They always wanted to know who were the people beginning revolts, both in St. Lucia and Martinique, to find out what they could. We don't know if in some cases they killed some of them, but some of them were then deported to Senegal, Gorée, by the French. In terms of the English, they deported us to slave forts in Sierra Leone. Our experiences are caught brilliantly, I think, in one of the songs by Dame Cécenne Descartes. Mama ladi why? What loja bat mamam? What loja pat papam? What loji bien mawen? Sa se kana sauvai? What loja bat mama? So, sorry about my voice. I need a rum, but I'll have to do with water. But what Cécenne is saying, Wadlow, the king of the sea, the British, has beaten my mother. Wadlow, the British, has beaten my father. Wadlow is a savage seabird. It is a wild duck. Wadlow has beaten our mothers. Why? So in our oral literatures, we continue to report and understand our history and where we won and where we have had to endure severe losses. In terms of the next important group after Africans in St. Lucia were the Three Colors. And their history is a mixed history. In 1823, they comprised 8 free-colored militias who went to hunt maroons and counter-slave revolts in addition to the 4 white militia companies. So as well as the whites hunting us, some of the mulattoes, the light-skinned people, in order to keep what they thought were better conditions for themselves and plantations that they had gained, they, if you like, put up more men to come and hunt Africans in St. Lucia. Indeed, in 1824, they petitioned the legislature to remove previous French legislation which restricted their rights in contrast to whites. They owned 1/6 of all slaves in the island in 1831. And also, they owned quite a lot of Castries Harbour. So in their minds, they were wondering, look, why is this white person having more rights than me? I have more money than them, or I have more power than them. But as in South Africa, they were not looking for rights for the whole of St. Lucia, just for themselves. The next group in were Barbadians. They were part of neo-colonial rule and featured as representatives of the British in St. Lucia as teachers in a mainly patois Creole-speaking population. In 1905, according to the British registers, the Blue Books, 32% of them were criminals. In 1905, many were in the police force, as many St. Lucians, given this history of resistance and fighting against oppression, did not want to join the police force. If I move, coming towards the end, my section on the future in the past and present. The past history and language issues between 1654 and 1901 point to cultural formation, i.e., despite being oppressed, forming our own language and culture, and at the same time acquiring land. Many times we got acquisition to land through métayage or sharecropping, but certainly we were left after slavery with more than 10 acres and a mule, which the Black Americans never got. I have to correct myself, it's supposed to be 40 acres and a mule. But St. Lucians were left with more land per head, per ex-slave population than many other areas in the world. However, if we move towards the present, we can see that we're in a period of cultural loss, the loss of land, and as Tennyson Joseph points out, perhaps we have put our sovereignty for sale. We pose a number of questions. Where can we get leaders with the commitment and determination of our past maroon leaders? One of the comments in the slave forts where we were returned to as a punishment for revolt and revolution, the people were commenting, i.e. the people who controlled the slave forts, they were saying that, look, once these chaps who had fought revolution in the Caribbean were returned, they started to stir up the groups already in Sierra Leone, Gore, etc., to fight for their rights as well. Where do we get leaders of that kind of mettle who are dead certain that the only show in town is looking after us? And if it costs their own life, they're mine. Where do we get such people again? However, other things are less on leadership and more on some of our behaviors. A woman of 97 was raped in November 2015, I think around the Miku area. If you think of these in Creole, bon Dieu Seigneur, diable ka marche en la ouya, moun di ki an vie moun nou ka porte ou espè te croisé parmi nous. Moun violé an vie madame qui ni tellement l'âge, Qui maladie qui tombe anti pays nous? In terms of a translation, God our Savior, the devil walks openly in the streets. People say that an old person, people who we hold in respect, was destroyed in our midst. People raped an old lady who was 97. What malady has come down in our little country? These are unthinkable acts in the Creole patois past, but they seem to be the advertisement of new philosophies of individualism and human dislocation from any concept of community, let alone a common history. Violence which we used against our past enemies, e.g., slave traders and plantation racists, now appears to be turned inward with no apparent profit motive, but perhaps expressions of deep anger and self-hatred. In such a situation, who needs external enemies? We grow our own. Given these kinds of analysis of looking at the past, not through rose-colored spectacles, but saying, well, look, they created a language out of the French words and African grammar. They managed to feed themselves in St. Lucia. They managed to get freedom. They managed to fight their enemies in order to get freedom in St. Lucia, although for not as long a period as we would like. And then when you compare this to the present, you have to hold yourself to account. You have to say, well, something is lost. In a sense, often I think of Caribbean cricket. In the past, we were masters. Clive Best, Lloyd, etc. These guys were unbeaten because we were a collective. However, later on, we moved from the collective to the period of the individual. And from then on, it was downhill. So if you think of that as an analogy, you will get a picture of what I think. I think my hopes for the book is that it gives a reference to early source documents that I certainly wouldn't know existed till I went to Senegal. The National Archives, Dakar, certainly there are many in the British Public Records Office, the British Museum, and a new website, Legacies of British Slave Ownership. And I certainly hope it can help in getting a CXC in St. Lucian history within the curriculum. And certainly for further support in the Key Stage 2 use of St. Lucia as part of the British curriculum. It all points to a history of struggle, defeat, and victory, as well as clarifying past internal and external enemies as an indicator of such forces in the emerging present. And I end, as I often do, in terms of that, in saying Chebe wed, or as people continue to correct me, I shouldn't be speaking like a Martinican. I should say Chebe for. However it is, I think that given all we've been through and given what I see of the present, the struggle continues. I have traveled in many countries, China, India, Vietnam, etc. And I come to two conclusions. One, in all cases, there is a negative perception of people of African descent. However, it runs side by side that in some of those very areas, take, for instance, southern Thailand, Philippines, the Andaman Islands of India, there are Black people there. So it leaves you with the understanding that as the first people on the planet, we've been everywhere before everybody else. As a consequence of that, this breeds a lot of jealousy, and as a consequence, a need by them, out of guilt and jealousy, to oppress people of African descent. However, sadly, lots of African people and people of African descent actually believe in this nonsense. They believe that all of this is normal. It isn't in any way normal. And as a consequence of that, we need to, if you like, be thinking of other things. My recommendations, and I'll run through them relatively quickly: funding for St. Lucian history and language in schools and abroad in our high commissions, to see St. Lucian history as part of African and human history, which I've talked about before, to tell the young their history to help them function better in the present. Because if somebody keeps on telling you on television that the only image for you is Superfly, drug pusher, etc., they keep telling you that your only fate is if you are doing something negative. If you are weak-minded, you will believe them. And I think one way of reducing the weak-mindedness is to put the young in touch with their history so that they have mental alternatives. I think, as well as that, the importance of language in the curriculum is that it is not only something to help you communicate, it also is a series of mental patterns in the mind. If you can master your own mental patterns and be aware of it, it is useful in terms of your mental development. I think learning through examining the works of previous Caribbean writers, for example, Sir Arthur Lewis, is useful. I mean, if you go through stuff like Arthur Lewis, Sir Dwight Veneer, even Walcott, you come to one inexorable conclusion: it is best to be self-sufficient. Arthur Lewis's whole model is about self-sufficiency economically, and Walcott is about self-sufficiency emotionally and culturally. We need to have an active role in our own redemption and reparation. It is not only one in which, in a sense, we ask the perpetrators for resources. We need to own up to our own weaknesses and deal with them, because other than that, the cycle continues. Certainly, as far as language is concerned, reparations are incredibly important, because not one penny was ever spent by the Europeans in helping us learn any form of language when we got into the New World. We formed the Creoles out of the African patterns that we kept and using the words they allowed us to use. But we're at this stage on our own resources. I think for the next generation, one needs more resources into schools to push language, culture, and history. I think the issue for plantation overseers is that in terms of the British, they certainly competed or hated the French in St. Lucia. But at the end of slavery in St. Lucia, the British compensated the French plantation owners in St. Lucia. Again, not one penny was spent in compensating us for our free labor. This kind of rubs with me for a kind of personal reason. I mean, I once did a job as an inspector of schools, a senior inspector of schools. And as senior inspector, I was looking after, I think, about 15 inspectors. And then suddenly another chap, he was also senior inspector, but he was white. He only had 5 inspectors he was managing. And he told me that he was earning £5,000 more than me. I was angry. So I wrote to, HR, and I explained to them that I needed a change because, as the descendant of a slave, there is no way that I would enjoy this experience. Now, if, you may say £5,000 is just a small thing in history, but imagine all of this labor that we have invested in this system and have not got a penny to show for it. Imagine if we looked at this in the way that we're doing now. So I think that it's only natural justice that there should be reparations, but I also think that there is an area in which we need to make some efforts in our own redemption. It's it's not simply an issue of saying, yes, okay, we'll get some resources. I'd like to see any resources pumped into education and skills so that people are armed to face the new world, the modern world, in a better way. But as I said, malgré tout, chebe for ek chebe wed. I think I've come to the end of what I wanted to say, Chair.
Merci en pile, Dr. Dalfini. We want to thank you very much, Dr. Dalfini, as we come to approach the end of today's presentation. And folks, what we have just seen and heard from Dr. Dalfini is all of the more reason why we have to ensure that our history goes back to school. He concluded with recommendations that we need to also take into consideration. And of course, Dr. Dalfini, your presentation will continue to be presented. We cannot end today's show without coming to some conclusions about those that the National Reparations Committee wish to table for your active consideration, viewers. And these are the following. 1, we want to call for official recognition of August 23rd by St. Lucia and the rest of CARICOM. 2, we want to call for a slave history project in every CARICOM member state. Number 3, we want to take St. Lucian and Caribbean authors to our schools. And in the case of St. Lucia, finally, we want to take Creole to St. Lucian schools. So, folks, as with every good thing, today's program comes to an end. But before we remind and inform you of the upcoming National 2022 Laos Day celebration, and of course another interesting local history book that's also a film, a book, and written and directed by St. Lucia's Mathurin Emmanuel. And here we want to thank Dr. Dalfini for his presentation today. We also want to thank member entities of the National Reparations Committee, and we want to thank our NTN team led by Davina Lee, another award-winning St. Lucian film producer, the CDF team led by creative director Drania Frederick and including Ria Modeste, and all of you who took time off to join NTN and the National Reparations Committee for this presentation in memory and observance of August 23rd as International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition. So here is hoping that we have enkindled and rekindled your consciousness as we prepare for observing 1 week from today, the International Day for People of African Descent, right here on NTN. Same place, same time, from 11 a.m. to 12:30 on Wednesday, August 31st. See you there.